Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Bienvenue à cette deuxième journée du colloque Reclaim Récits d'artistes femmes africaines. Je m'appelle Anaïs Rush, je m'occupe du développement international de l'association Aware et je coordonne dans ce cadre ce colloque. Celui-ci s'inscrit dans la programmation de la Saison Africa2020, dont le commissariat général est assuré par Anne Gonefal. Il est financé grâce à un soutien de l'Institut français et organisé en partenariat avec l'école du Louvre. Je tiens à remercier ses partenaires institutionnels et financiers, ainsi que l'ensemble du comité scientifique, grâce à qui le programme est aussi riche et diversifié, comme vous l'avez peut-être vu hier et comme vous le verrez cet après-midi. Je remercie également Nadine Oupatin, présidente de cette séance, qui sera consacrée aux récits de femmes. Merci à toutes et à tous. Je vous souhaite un excellent colloque et la parole est à toi, Nadine.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Évidemment, je vous souhaite la bienvenue, hein, comme Anaïs vient de le faire. Je suis Nadine Oupatin, cofondatrice de la plateforme The Arts Momentum et de l'agence culturelle Artness. Alors, je suis particulièrement heureuse de participer et d'être témoin de cet événement parce que pour moi, hein, à l'image de la Saison Africa 2020, c'est non seulement une formidable opportunité d'enrichissement et de découverte pour chacun d'entre nous, mais c'est surtout, à mon sens, le rappel de la nécessité d'une forme de solidarité, hein, d'une intelligence collective pour certains, voire d'une sororité pour les autres. Et cela bien au-delà des frontières et des fuseaux horaires. Alors, merci évidemment à l'équipe de WEAR, à Anne Gonefal de la Saison Africa, et merci à nos invités, Gladys Calicini, Martha Kazungu, Ruth Bellinga, Nadira Lagoun et Rachida Triki, qui malheureusement, pour des raisons indépendantes de sa volonté, ne pourra pas se joindre à nous. Évidemment, je ferai une brève introduction de chacune de nos invités avant leurs interventions respectives d'aujourd'hui, intitulée Récits de femmes. Et je voudrais revenir rapidement justement sur le thème de cette journée. Récits de femmes, eh bien, c'est l'idée d'aborder la question de l'artiste femme, hein. Qu'est-ce qu'on entend par artiste femme? Quels sont les enjeux et la portée de leurs récits? Quelles stratégies et méthodologies ont été mises en œuvre pour recueillir leurs histoires? Et qu'en est-il des notions évidemment de féminité, de conditions féminines lorsqu'on parle d'art ou de création? Enfin, il sera intéressant de voir de quelle façon ces notions façonnent ce qui est accepté, ce qui est compris, ce qui est archivé ou pas, dans la formation des récits de l'art moderne, des récits de l'histoire de l'art moderne et contemporain. Alors, les observations, et les pratiques, développées par nos intervenantes témoignent, révèlent, ces récits et participent du coup à la formation, à la définition des contours d'une histoire de l'art à travers le prisme de ces femmes artistes originaires de Zambie, du Zimbabwe, d'Ouganda, du Cameroun, de Tunisie ou encore d'Algérie, puisque ce sont les pays sur lesquels portent les études de nos invités. À présent, je vous propose de commencer avec une première communication qui est celle de Gladys Kalincini. Alors Gladys est une jeune artiste visuelle contemporaine basée à Lusaka en Zambie. Elle est doctorante à l'Université de Rhodes en Afrique du Sud et membre du programme de recherche Arts of Africa et Global South, soutenu par la Andrew Mellon Foundation et la National Research Foundation of South Africa. Gladys est aussi chercheuse universitaire pour le programme Africa No Filter en soutien aux jeunes universitaires africains. Et son travail porte principalement sur les notions d'effacement, les notions de mémoire, de représentation et de visibilité des femmes dans les histoires de la résistance coloniale en Zambie et au Zimbabwe. Son essai s'intitule, alors je vais vous le dire en français, hein, conflit d'archives, réinventer et visualiser les récits sociopolitiques des femmes combattantes pour la liberté en Zambie et au Zimbabwe. Alors, elle part du constat de la sous-représentation des femmes, hein, invisibilisées dans l'histoire nationale et la mémoire collective de la Zambie et du Zimbabwe. Et l'intervention de Gladys se concentre sur l'analyse de cette sous-représentation, ses formes et surtout ses conséquences dans les récits des luttes de libération nationale, à travers notamment l'étude de la tentative de reconstitution du parcours de ces femmes combattantes pour la liberté, femmes africaines dont les histoires ont été mal, voire entièrement supprimées des récits historiques. Bonjour Gladys, je te laisse la parole.
As introduced, I'm a practicing artist and researcher, and also currently a PhD candidate in art history at Rhodes University in Makanda, South Africa. My PhD thesis conceptualizes the notion of seeing, relooking, and reimagining national independence narratives as a means of critically analyzing the gender biases therein. The underlying assumption of my research is that there is a gendered predisposition inherent in representations and accounts of liberation struggle histories that tend to pit the Black man both as the victim and victor of colonization, such that many performances by women have been relegated to the margins of invisibility. In my PhD research, I am interested in three forms of visual categories, which are 1, archival photography and documentary film, and 2, national monuments and public gestures of memory. Finally, 3, contemporary artistic practices of 3 artists of Zambian and Zimbabwean descent, including myself as a Zambian artist and the works of Kudzanai Churai and Gresham Nyaude, who are both of Zimbabwean descent. In the artistic practices of the 3 artists that I focus on, I am interested in notions of looking at, looking up, looking down, looking within, and looking beyond dominant liberation narratives as a way of engaging and recreating alternative histories that consider roles performed by women. For today's presentation, which I have titled Conflicting Archives, Reimagining and Visualizing Sociopolitical Narratives of Women Freedom Fighters in Zambia and Zimbabwe, I will focus on discussing archival photographs associated with select women at the cusp of 1964 and 1980, which are the periods of independence in Zambia and Zimbabwe, respectively. I make an exception and include 2 photographs from the 1800s that are associated with the historic and visual narrative of Charo Nyakasikana, who's popularly referred to as Mbuya Nyahanda, as she was active and alive during the time of the first Chimurenga, or the first war of liberation, that is popularly referred to as the revolutions in Mashona land and Matebele land from 1896 to 1897. In contributing to the broader themes of today's focus, which are narratives of womanhood, I reference, In contributing to the broader theme of focus today, which is narratives of womanhood, I reference a photographic archive of women performing particular actions in public and discuss the corporal function of performances by women's bodies in public space and within specific cultural and political contexts. In responding to the question of what it means to be a woman artist, I'm sorry. In responding to the question of what it means to be a woman artist and how notions of feminine and womanhood shape what is accepted, recorded, or understood in the formation of art historical narratives, I draw attention to the artwork titled "These Practices Are Done in Sharing Her Stories," which is an ongoing production of digital videos of women cleansing their hands and feet as they reperform what Zimbabwean curator Fadzai Muchemwa frames as acts of caring and solidarity, and what yesterday's keynote speaker Nontombeko Ntombela alluded to as gestures of remembering as opposed to forgetting. What is also important to note is that these restaged performances are produced as reactions and responses to some of the archival photographs that I will discuss today. In the discussion from yesterday titled "Contesting the Archive, Namibian Artists' Negotiation of the Colonial Past," Julia Rensing spoke about how two Namibian artists engage with photographic archives in their artistic practices. Beyond considering what might be possibly absent in the Namibian archives, Rensing's presentation unfolded into how artists' work could be considered as a means of recuperating and healing. Quite similarly, the staged performances on your screens at the moment also draw from photographic archives in spaces of state-sanctioned memory to speak to ideas about collective mourning and sharing, as performances in the videos are synchronized such that when installed, the women's actions in the videos parallel and mimic each other. By spaces of state-sanctioned memory here, I refer to national and physical archives which theorists such as Jacques Derrida and historians such as Pierre Nora conceptualize as spaces of power because the histories and stories they tell are constructed from those who command. In this presentation, such spaces include the National Archives of Zambia and the United National Independence Party archives. From now on, I will refer to as the UNIP archives. In Zimbabwe, the archives include the National Archives of Zimbabwe and the National Archives of the political party, the Zimbabwe African National Union Patriotic Front, which I will now refer to as ZANU-PF. I will begin now by taking you along with me on a journey as I recall one of my earlier encounters in the National Archives of Zambia in 2016. In the earlier part of that year, I went to the National Archives of Zambia on Nationalist Road in Lusaka in an expedition to acquire information about two women, Julia Chikamoneka and Alice Lenshina, who were central to my master's research project. When I walked into the library section of the archives, I was confronted by a musty room full of index drawers and filing cabinets that one had to go through to find any information. I looked through the digital folders labeled Women in the Independence Struggle and was only able to find 3 photographs that relate to Chikamoneka and none of Lenshina in the subfolders of that main independence folder. 2 of those 3 images are on your screens right now. The next day, I went to the UNIP archives in Emmersdale only to be told that the archives had moved to Chachacha Road and that some archival material had been destroyed, other materials had been boxed up, while the rest of the materials had been sent to the main national archives as part of a digitalization project to preserve historical records. As I made my way to the UNIP location, I noticed that the new UNIP address overlooked an old, unfinished and dilapidated building that was constructed by the UNIP government after independence. The irony in this new placement was that the new placement of the office was as if the site of the rundown building across the street highlighted to the state of the archives, which were also just as old, derelict, and decaying. I went to these particular archives because they seemed to be good places in which one could exhume women's narratives that are possibly invisible outside the topographies of the archives. However, this experience highlighted that history as recorded within these archives was disappearing and that the few women in its records along with it. Drawing from my experiences within archives in Zambia and Zimbabwe, I am of the view that there is a flaccity in the way in which history is retained within these particular archives. By flaccity, which I derive from the word flax, I am referring to a state of constantly being unsettled and unstable, or constantly being susceptible to change. The experience also revealed that there was an invisibility of representations of women's political and visual narratives. For me, looking through these archives was like seeing into the abyss, into a place where there were specific narratives about women that were on the verge of invisibility. There was an absence, a woman-shaped gap, I would call it. This experience forms a basis for my entry into the discussions about conservations of women's narratives and into the collection and formation of an alternative archive of visual documentations of performances of women that sought to redress colonial authority in their respective localities. I have since collected scans of photographs of different women from the National Archives of Zambia, the UNIP Archives, National Archives of Zimbabwe, and the ZANU-PF Archives, as well as from private archives of various individuals, including Bessie Chiwesa-Kunda Kankasa, who was also a woman freedom fighter in Zambia and an acquaintance of Chika Maneka. I've also had the privilege to access private archives of Martha Mangeni, who is Chika Moneka's granddaughter and is currently situated in Harare, Zimbabwe, and Nkatia Barbara Chengo, who is the great-granddaughter of Emilia Saidi, who is the woman on the other side of Chika Moneka in the image on your screen. Chengo currently lives in Lusaka, Zambia. As all of the photographs in these particular presentations are available and were acquired from the National Archives in Zambia and Zimbabwe, it is befitting that before I proceed to discuss them, I provide a brief context of the archives and continue to provide brief contributions of at least 2 women who feature in my alternative archive. The National Archives in Zambia and Zimbabwe began as an entity in 1935 and were located in Salisbury in southern Rhodesia, which is now referred to as Zimbabwe, because that is where the administrative capital of the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland was located. There is a whole scholarship on the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, but I do not dwell on it in this presentation. A depository of the archives was set up in Livingstone in northern Rhodesia in 1947. However, that depository would later close down and the records would be transferred back from Livingstone to Harare. After the fall of the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland in 1956, the archives would separate, with the archives in Harare remaining where they currently are and a new archive being set up in Lusaka. The National Archives of Zambia, the National Archives of Zimbabwe, the UNIP Archives, and the ZANU-PF Archives are all linked in the sense that they have a similar genesis, and in the perspective that they are curated in a similar manner. The 2 main national archives, which is the National Archives of Zambia and the National Archives of Zimbabwe, are parastatals, and the stories they tell are heavily influenced by the state. While the two Independence Party archives, which is the UNIP Archives and the ZANU-PF archives, are constructed from the perspective of the parties that were in national leadership at the time. UNIP in 1964 for the case of Zambia and ZANU-PF in 1980 for the case of Zimbabwe. It is important, though, that I note that for the case of Zimbabwe, ZANU-PF is both the Independence Party and the only party to hold presidential office since 1980, and as such is credited largely for curating history of Zimbabwean independence in both archives in the country. I will now proceed to introduce 2 women, starting with the woman on your screen right now. Julia Chika Moneka was born in 1910 in Kasama and died on 28 March in 1986. She was initially known as Julia Mulengan Sofwa and changed her last name to Chika Moneka after 1938 when she was a participant of political activities in Northern Rhodesia. According to Bessie Chiwesa-Kunda Kankasa, who was also her colleague in the UNIP's Women Brigade, Sofwa formed her pseudonym from the expression Chika Moneka Ichubatu Chushisha, which loosely translates from Michivemba to English as it will be seen why they make us suffer or the cause of our suffering shall be revealed. The word Chika Moneka itself translates as it will be seen, it will become, and it will become revealed. One of the reasons she changed her name was because during her political career, Julia Chika Moneka Julia Chikamoneka was repeatedly arrested for inciting citizens to protest against the British colonial administration and for hosting some of the UNIP members who were threatened with imprisonment in her house. As a widow in the 1940s, Chikamoneka moved from Copperbelt province to Lusaka, where she joined other women, such as Kankasa, in political activities. In 1948, Chikamoneka and other freedom fighters formed the Northern Rhodesia Teachers' Welfare, which later transformed and partly became responsible for the formation of a political party called the Northern Rhodesia African Congress. When the Northern Rhodesian African Congress disbanded, Chikamoneka joined a breakaway party named the Zambia African National Congress, ZANCO, where she was influential in mobilizing women to become members. The political party ZANCO would later be banned by the Rhodesian administrative authorities, and its leaders would be arrested and detained. Chikamoneka, along with women like Betty Kaunda, Saidi, and Mumba, who are both with her in the image on your right, would come together to form another political party called African National Independence Party, also ANIP, which later worked alongside the UNIP and morphed into what we now refer to as the UNIP Women's Brigade. In what is conceivably the most prominent public memory of Chikamoneka, illustrated in the photograph on the right of your screen, she, Emilia Saidi, and Mandalena Mumba take off their clothes while weeping and protesting in 1961, and Chikamoneka proceeds to slap Ian MacLeod, who is delivering a British-inspired constitution to particularly Roy Welensky, African people, and not them to build the nation for us. I will now introduce Chimura, or the First War of Liberation, denotes the Chinduduma, or an uprising, between the years of 1896 and 1897, which is commonly referred to as the Ndebele Shona Revolution against colonization, which is believed to have been stimulated by Mbuyane Handa. Nyakasikana was born in 1840 in Shawasha district in central Mashonaland and was hanged to death in 1898 in Salisbury, which is now Harare, after she was captured and tried for her involvement in the Ndebele Shona uprising. In this trial, she was charged for ordering the murder of Henry Hawkins Pollard, as she was accused of ordering for his head to be cut off. She denied these accusations, but nonetheless was sentenced to death. Nyakasikana was the daughter of Chitaura, son of Shaya Chimwe, founder of the Hwata dynasty in the Upper Mazoe Valley. She resided in Chidamba's village and was believed to be a Vikoro, or a spirit medium, whose body was inhabited by the Mondoro of Nyamitane Handa, who had earlier lived and state. Essentially is a school belonged to Tien of Nehanda. Nyakasikana's role making oracular declarations and facilitating ceremonies that were thought to ensure good rains and good harvests. Mbuyane Handa was well esteemed and influential and held an influential religious and cultural position in the society she was part of in the 1800s, as she was believed to facilitate even communication between Mwari, who is God, and the people. And as such, she was both the voice of Mwari and the voice of her ancestors. Reports by Zimbabwean writers such as Chigumanzi and Charumbira suggest that when white settlers began arriving in Mashonaland in the 1800s, spirit mediums in various sections of the land are said to have encouraged good relations between locals and Europeans. Mbuyane Handa is actually believed to have advised the people in her society not to fear newcomers, but rather to be cordial and welcome them through the offering of the meat of a black cow. As the Europeans settled in, they began to take control of most aspects of Mashona land and Matebele land, such as the imposition of land and hut taxes and the local people. They also began to appropriate land, force locals into labor, control women, control trade and farming, which naturally strained the good relations that had previously been encouraged by the spirit mediums. Eventually, locals began to revolt against settlers' behaviors and impositions after the imposition of the hat tax by European settlers in 1896. The spirit mediums such as Nehanda began to encourage locals to stand up for themselves and to fight for their land. Nehanda and Kaguvi went further to preach messages of revolution and of war in Mashona land, which eventually culminated into the first Chimurenga. Some of Nehanda's messages echoed the locals' disgruntlements and suggested that Mwari had implied that the cause of all the trouble that had come upon the land was because of the white settlers. According to her, Mwari declared that white settlers were the cause of the suffering and had to be removed from Mashona land for peace to prevail. The mediums reassured the locals that Mwari would not only protect them, but also make them victorious in the Chundunduma, which is in the liberation or in the protests. In the following year of the protests, which is 1897, Mbuya Nehanda was captured by colonial administration of the British South Africa Company. She was tried, but as it would be difficult to prove that she participated in the revolution spiritually, she was rather charged for ordering the murder of Pollard. Men who had come up as witnesses claimed that Nehanda had requested for Pollard's head to be chopped off, and a male jury found her guilty of the murder of the native commissioner, and she was sentenced to death. In the photograph of your right, Nehanda stands along with 3 other individuals who were pinned with taking leadership roles in the revolution of 1896 to 1897, and the photograph was taken as a trophy to show the British South Africa Company's success in ending the Chimurenga and killing the mediums. The heads of all the 4 people were then sent to London as trophies of this victory. With that brief introduction, I will now begin talking a little bit about some of the images that I did find in the archives in relation to how the independence narratives are positioned within national archives in Zambia and Zimbabwe. Yeah. So I'm going to begin by explaining why I provide introductions of 2 different women. I do so to avoid implying sameness of women's experiences and participations in national activities. For instance, the images that you see on your screen now are similar to the epitomized image of the woman freedom fighter in Africa, which usually depicts a woman in military attire holding a gun. Sometimes this image is shown with a woman with a baby on her back and a gun on her back. While I acknowledge that such imagery can be perceived both as domesticated versions of women, I also suggest that they could also be powerful, they could also be symbolically powerful images. Yeah? But however, I am still able to acknowledge as well that such imagery is not representative of all women of African descent who participated in independence protests, rallies, and even wars. This is not to say that there is a 0 proportion of women with similar experiences There is indeed actually a plethora of shared experiences by women, both literally and by association. But it is important to be able to see and acknowledge difference in the ways in which women were involved and how they are portrayed in archival photography. Difference, as Stuart Hall puts it, is essential to meaning. Differences allow us not to just create boundaries or to separate, they rather enhance meanings and knowledges that are both positional and relational. See? But looking at the images of women in the archives, I realized that performances by women are generally presented as spectacles or as aberrations as explained by Paige Eger when she writes that historically women who have participated in political activities have generally been viewed as an abnormality or as extraordinary. And in this case, being extraordinary would relate to being remarkably outstanding or above normality. In talking about how these women's these women's narratives are presented as spectacles, I will draw your attention now to a performance by Mbuyane, who I have just introduced the day before she dies, which is an account given by Father Richards as he goes to relay the news that she's going to die. He writes, however, when in the evening about 6 o'clock, I saw her again and in the presence of Victor, who tried his best to persuade her to listen to me, told her that she would have to die the next morning. She began to behave like a mad woman. She took her blankets and she refused. She took her blankets and wished to leave the cell. And when told to remain and keep quiet, she refused and said she never would endure to be locked up. When I saw that nothing could be done with her, I went away with Victor, and Nahanda began to dance, to laugh and to talk, so that the warders were obliged to tie her hands and watch her continually as she threatened to kill herself. Chirumbaira responds to this account by Father Franz by suggesting that she disagrees with his characterization of her performance in public and suggests that she does not believe that it is of psychiatric madness as he suggests. While I'm not in the position to give any psychiatric evaluation, I'm inclined to agree with Charumbira, as from the performance of Chika Monica, when she begins to dance and refuses to be killed, she still offers to kill herself as she is frustrated. It appears she's frustrated as she has been accused for a crime that she has denied, and it would be disgraceful for a woman in such a position as hers, such a powerful one, to be killed by the colonialists that she is eventually fighting against. So in my conclusion, I read this performance, well, from reading in between the lines, my conclusion would be that this is an action of anger, or of dissent, or feeling let down by the people that had come up and testified against her. You know? Spectacles are images and performances of extravagant display, as shown in Nehanda's performance. And often they involve a viewer's curiosity or contempt and marvel or admiration through much of the spectacle's appeal derived from its visual power and ability to hold the gaze of the spectator as described by Nuttall. While undressing in public could be viewed as a spectacle, women historically displayed their bodies in public for specific reasons. I come to this point in the discussion in also pointing out the archive's failures to correctly contextualize these women's narratives by putting them up just as mere spectacles. Because as if you look at the images, most of the women have agency and understand why they are performing in this way in public. Yes. So women use their bodies in public in very specific ways, such as undressing, as in the case of in the photograph on your left, weeping and laying down to express feelings and sentiments of abjection and dissonance. Women such as Pauline Opango Lumumba in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which most of you might know as Lumumba's widow, and women illustrated in the photographs on your screens now, similarly to Chika Moneka, Saidi, and Mumba, undressed in the public domain to publicly express their dismay. In this way, women's bodies can be seen as signifiers of the corporeality of the body as a political instrument, as explained by feminist art historian Griselda Pollock. Even in contemporary times, such as women such as Stella Nyanzi in Uganda still employ the body to grab attention and communicate in certain ways. I will return quite briefly at looking at this image of Chika Moneka, which I'm highlighting right now on your left. If you look in the image, Chika Moneka is on your left with the white fabric wrapped around her pelvic area. Around her waist and neck, she has a rope or a noose tied around it with an open blouse while her breasts hang out. Next to her, and also holding up a sign that says Kaunda knows democracy, Welensky and Horn mean Nazism, support Kaunda by one-man vote, is Emilia Saidi. On the back of Chika Moneka is Mandalena Mumba, who appears to only be wearing a piece of cloth around her pelvic area and what appears to be a shirt in the an open shirt as suggested by the far open left of the image over here. I continue also now to look at some of the ways in which women's bodies perform when they are not necessarily creating what the archives would frame as spectacles. So what would be considered as women participating in regular political activities. On your screen right now, you're looking at an image of Chibesa Kunda Kankasa acquired from the National Archives of Zambia. Chibesa Kunda Kankasa stands in the center of the image, wearing fabrics with stripes and a head wrap around her head and standing behind a microphone, suggesting that she is speaking. To her left is 4 women wearing what appears to be political chitenges, as suggested by the portraits that is embedded on the materials. And on her left is 4 other women, 5 other women rather, I'm sorry. 2 of them are standing behind her while 3 of them are directly on her right. I continue also to highlight some of the images that I had found where to me it seemed that women were asserting their agencies and urgencies in much more subtle ways, or in ways that were not as, could not be categorized as maybe more violent or more Protestant, but maybe in more subtle ways of protesting, but in some ways still implying colonial violence that is in their people. So in the images on your screen right now, you have an image of an unidentified woman from the archives with a placard that says, "Hon, you have sold us down the river." So she is quite clearly communicating what she feels. And I found several other images of this situation. In conclusion, the photographs that I have shown in this presentation tell complex stories. In some instances, they give similar perspectives while simultaneously showing explicit and nuanced differences in how women from various contextual backgrounds participated in the broader context of liberation struggles in their respective countries. The presentation also suggests that women's erasures within Zambian and Zimbabwean histories can partially be attributed to only documenting women in certain ways, such as only in messianic movements, as in the case of women such as Mbuyane Handa, Alice Lenshina, and many others. They are also documented as traditional leaders for the case of women such as Nkomesha Mukamambo, and only as assistants to men in political activities in the case of women like Joyce Mujuru, Margaret Dongo, and Julia Chika Moneka. However, I also attach the kind of erasure to the lack of detailed analysis of specific women's historical narratives that is inherent in most dominant liberation narratives. Narratives and histories concerning women have for long been subjected to patriarchal structures that are hostile and only obscure them. Even though this is the context, one of hostility that has been subjected to most women, the photographic evidence in this presentation suggests that most of the women have refused to remain silent or to remain hidden in history, as their narratives have to remain in history as they protest remaining behind shadows. They protest against being forgotten. And in ending this presentation, I will end with a video clip of of Margaret Dongo after she wins the by-elections in Zimbabwe, where she's talking about being able to challenge the systems in Zimbabwe. I
feel very much happy to be part of the change of the system in Zimbabwe. And I feel very happy to be the first independent woman to stand the parliamentary election and win. And I'm going to be the first independent parliamentarian in our House of Assembly. So I feel very proud. And historically, you know, our system has never been challenged, and it has been challenged by a woman, and they have won in court. And I've gone further in actual fact to prove to them, to prove the point to them.
Thank you. That is it from me.
Merci, thank you very much. Pardon, hein, je vais continuer en français. Merci beaucoup Gladys, c'était vraiment très intéressant, très émouvant. On se rend compte par ailleurs de l'importance de l'archive photographique qui a nourri le travail de Gladys. Et malgré le fait que ces femmes soient très présentes, bien présentes dans les luttes d'indépendance, on a vraiment du mal à comprendre pourquoi elles ont été autant invisibilisées ou mal représentées. Se pose alors évidemment le problème de qui constitue les archives, qui écrit l'histoire. Ça, je pense qu'on va y revenir au moment des questions-réponses. En tout cas, merci beaucoup Gladys. J'aimerais à présent vous présenter une jeune conservatrice et historienne de l'art ougandaise. Il s'agit de Martha Kazungu. Martha vit à Hambourg et exerce au Mark Museum de Rothenbaum. Elle est titulaire d'une maîtrise en art verbal et visuel d'Afrique avec une spécialisation en conservation et médias de l'université de Bayreuth en Allemagne. Elle possède également une licence en art industriel et beaux-arts de la Margaret Troll School of Industrial and Fine Art de l'université de Makerere en Ouganda. Et en tant que commissaire indépendante, Martha travaille actuellement sur 2 expositions qui auront lieu en 2022 au Tyrol et à Hambourg, sous l'égide de la 8e triennale de la photographie de la ville. Le projet qu'elle nous présente s'intitule Njabala. Évidemment, elle nous expliquera ce que veut dire Njabala, mais c'est vers l'activation des pluralités de la féminité ougandaise comme site de résistance. Le travail de Martha est le résultat de plusieurs années de recherche, et en se concentrant sur les scènes artistiques ougandaises à travers des visites de studio, des rencontres, des entretiens, des articles et des expositions, Martha questionne les différentes acceptations du concept de féminité, évidemment dans le contexte spécifique de l'Ouganda. Njabala, c'est un mot très particulier qui consiste en la mise en place d'espaces préservés au sein desquels les femmes pourraient interagir et dialoguer. Je rappelle juste, avant de donner la parole à Martha, que la première session de questions-réponses aura lieu après la 3e intervention, et je vous invite d'ores et déjà à envoyer vos questions via le chat. Chère Martha, bienvenue, je te laisse la parole.
Thank you, Nadine, for that really humbling introduction about myself. I'll just start to present my paper, and I'm really happy for this chance to speak about my project and about the projects of the several women I've been working with for 5 years now. And I hope that everyone tuning in today from wherever they are will be happy to listen to our story. So the project I'll be speaking about today is one I have been working on for a long time. Growing up in a conventional family in rural Eastern Uganda, I started to notice certain things that back then my younger self could not exactly grasp in words. And growing up with 3 brothers and recognizing how roles were distributed, how risk was calculated, and who was better to be preserved. Whether or not these arrangements favored me, I always noticed the difference. I always thought of the difference. And now, although I still struggle to encapsulate my pursuit in one complete unbiased term, I find the works of distinguished scholars key in facilitating my attempt to contextualize things, and in so doing, to reach the proximity of that which I want to mean without the bias of the term feminism. The discovery I made over the years was that my own story was not unique to me, but that several women across the country and the globe had their varying dosages of the injustices, regressive rules, advice, and caution, and all the discomfort embodied. My first curatorial chance was provided by the formidable BC Silva in 2016 when she accepted my application to attend the 2016 edition of Asiko School in Addis Ababa. The condition to apply was to propose a curatorial project to be developed within the 5 weeks of the intensive she led alongside many phenomenal experts in the arts from across the globe. And owing to my first encounter to confront my uneasiness with the whole structure of patriarchy, a singular moment that I remember during my 3rd year at university at Makerere Art School, when I reluctantly stumbled across a notice about an artwork workshop organized by the then Lettera 27, now Moleskine Foundation in Italy, and under the leadership of the prolific Simon Njami. The workshop was themed, "Should I Take Off My Shoes?" During this workshop was the first time and the first moment I dared to publicly question the aforementioned reality. I had experienced it, but didn't have the audacity to address it. As it was within the workshop, the act of taking off shoes was interpreted as leaving one's comfort zone. And my comfort zone was holding this feeling of knowing, but of not saying. As I slowly got the audacity to confront my own comfort, I decided to write an imaginary two-sided journal. An imaginary two-sided journal I decided to write an imaginary two-sided journal titled Exaggerated Memories, in which I outlined the several injustices lived by girls in Uganda on one side, and on the other side, a world after this, when a world with identity and freedom for the woman. These are just some of the images of that journal that I made. And as you look at the images of that journal, I'll just read what the caption was. My notebook tells about the untold predicament that I face because I'm a woman. There is hopelessness, plight, and despondency, and complacency that grind me. I'm talking about things which happen all the time, every day, year after year, not only at home, but everywhere I go. Along the way, men make fun of my body. They say my buttocks shake like huge potatoes. They stop me even when they have nothing to say. Society has set a life for me to live, and the moment I resist it, I stop existing. How then can I define me? Do I have an identity? I have a call to make, an invitation to a trip without shoes, where I am willing to risk it all, to a place where patriarchy is dead, a place where my identity is reconstructed and recognized. Soon, I was out of school, and the notebook was long donated to Moleskine Foundation, where it still rests until today. But within me, there was always this longing. And so, in preparation for my first ever exhibition proposal, an application to attend the Asiko School, I knew that it had to be a sort of continuation from the unfinished business of the previous year. And so I pitched to BC an exhibition whose title I don't remember, but the inspiration, a Luganda proverb, emese newegejetya yakapa. However big a rat grows, it's always for the cat. This proverb can be tilted to fit several meanings, but I was looking at it from the angle that women, however emancipated, will always be preyed by men. The proverb almost asserted that there is no hope for reverting things. And naive as I was, I still thought of an exhibition in the framework. I was proposing to work with men and female artists to interrogate gender relations and discussions. During my ASICO days, I received critique, read more about art and women artists, and it was then that I encountered relevant readings of Ngoni Fall, of Linda Nockons, of why are there no great women artists. And upon my return from Addis, I took on the Kampala Biennale job as assistant curator to Eliza Tangana, and I had to cope with the buzz of being in the creative industry. Several workshops followed. I still had unfinished business on. I continued my research. My presentation to you today is really about how I have used the past years to contribute to a topic that is very close to my heart. I have curated and written quite a number of texts, women artists only exhibitions, and projects including the Tuaye in 2018, the Embodiment of Reason in 2019, My Mother is Forgetting My Face in 2020, My Granary in My Home in 2020, and Sit at a Table in 2020. I've written about the work of B.C. Silva, Kelly Safia, Lillian Nablime, Teresa Musoke, Naache Nkuwa-Randolph, Georgina Maxim, Maria Brinch, among others. I've also held several interviews and studio visits with female artists from Africa and beyond, such as Maria Naita, Teresa Musoke, Lillian Nablime, Eileen Mark, Maria Brinch, among others. Today, I'll concentrate on a chronology and a mounting of related events, which altogether form this site of resistance when it comes to women artists in Uganda. Particularly, I'll share about the main events, which I demonstrate as a track of progress in my endeavor. I'll conclude by presenting the Njawala project, which I hope to pursue for the next couple of years. So I'll start with a studio visit at Maria Naita's home in Mutundwe. Maria Naita is a very prominent female artist who unfortunately had passed on in 2019. And she's of course known for her magnificent sculptures. But I bring Maria Naita at the beginning of my presentation today because of an interview I had at her home in 2017, in which I asked her the question to tell me about her opinion on the term womanhood. And I'm going to read her response to you. And my question was, what is your opinion or comment on womanhood? And she said, that's a hard question because it's a wide thing. I know that given the opportunity, we can do a lot. And the talk that I am a woman, I cannot do this is something from the past years, really. I have seen women building, women mixing concrete. I say, yes, we can. When I started out doing sculpture, I was told that it's a man's thing and that all girls in my class dropped out of the sculpture class except me. I remained because I had the passion and because I believed in myself. I believed we can do it. These are just some artworks from that studio visit to Maria Naita's home in her house in Mutundwe. Then I'll speak about Tuaye, which was held in 2018. Tuaye was inspired by the work of Helen Nabukenya, a Ugandan female artist who makes tapestries with the help of jobless women who she employs when they come to her house looking for casual jobs. During the creation of these tapestries, the women find a moment to share about their life experiences. The resulting tapestries embody a meaning beyond the actual tangible project. The Tuaye Intensive was about speaking with female artists about their practice and about brainstorming ways to intervene in the repressive scene of Uganda. The intensive was geared towards the exploration of potential forms of inhabiting a place and coexisting critically with its makeup to development. With Hot Gardens as the location, the intensive took place on 3rd and 4th of September 2018. The conversations held in the intensive were aimed at neutralizing the tensions surrounding feminine interaction and discussions. To that end, the selected artists, Pamela Enyonu, Sheila Nachitende, Stacey Gillian, Helen Nabukenya, Maria Brinch, and Sandra Suvi constructed a safe environment to talk and express themselves without holding back. In addition to speaking about their personal works, the participants discussed in detail the conditions under which they operated and brainstormed ideas of addressing the problem. The intensive was concluded with 2 visits, one to the studio of Lilian Navlime, and finally to the Kampala Art Biennale. One outcome of the tour was the obvious need to have large-scale exhibitions, which represented the opinions of female artists. It was agreed on that we would have our first such exhibition 2 years later in 2020, in the peak season for the Kampala art scene, the summer. We wanted to tap into the traffic, but everyone knows that a large-scale exhibition takes a lot of investment. And so, as a strategy of announcing our journey, I thought it feasible and relevant to start lukewarm with a smaller scale exhibition the next year. This was how and why we organized the Embodiment of Reason. For starters, the curatorial premise of Embodiment of Reason was easy. It was premised in my head as a very small exhibition, but eventually Embodiment of Reason turned out to be a significant site of resistance in ways I could never imagine. Everything stemmed from a last-minute venue cancellation, albeit reserved flights and service providers. It was shocking, frustrating, but I was reluctant to let it just pass. And so 2 weeks to the opening, I reached out to the Uganda National Museum Director, Rose Nkale, and asked her for a space. She told me she would really like to help me, but the temporary exhibition space was occupied with the Idi Amin exhibition and that there would be no other options, but that I would consult with the staff about a possibility of another location within the museum. I was taken around, showed several corners, saying that I would put work side by side with historical objects, and finally took a look at the car garage, which also served as a temporary storage space. Long story short, we took the museum. At first, I was reluctant. Would the artists accept their works here? But eventually I spilled the news, which were warmly accepted by both artists, Maria Brinch and Lilian Navlime. The extraordinary quality that we achieved with Embodiment of Reason was what started as a simple curatorial premise, with Maria Brinch's work with fabric and Lilian Navlime working with wood and clay. The show was just an interesting juxtaposition of experiencing materiality, of creativity, and how this affects perception and interpretation. And we ended up having a bold intrusion and disruption of a patriarchal space, since none of the cars shown in the Uganda Museum storage space belonged to a woman. All of them were driven by former presidents and kings. None of them was a woman. The exhibition therefore did more than its original plan. It disrupted a normalcy. I'll proceed on to another exhibition, My Mother is Forgetting My Face, which took place at Entre Gallery in Bergen. My Mother is Forgetting My Face takes on a metaphorical meaning where the mother is actually the nation and the face is actually the respective citizens of the concerned nations. In essence, the exhibition seeks to speak to the unspeakable injustices that nations render to their citizens. As a starting point, the exhibition speaks about 3 specific nations about which the exhibition about Myanmar, Uganda, and South Sudan. Maria Brinch commenting on resilience in Myanmar, Basheba Okwenje, and Miriam Machemba talking about South Sudan, and the consequent refugee crisis in Uganda. And most recently, Lilian Navlime speaking about the COVID-19 pandemic in Uganda, which has registered a set of inconsiderate policies to its citizens in the name of combating the spread of the virus. And then last but not least, I'll speak very briefly about Sit at a Table, which is also a solo exhibition that I had of the work featuring the work of Pamela Enyonu. Sit at the Table was an exhibition featuring the selection of artworks by Pamela Enyonu, a Ugandan artist living and working in Kampala. Enyonu's art brings to book an array of synergies pertaining to femininity, while simultaneously shining a spotlight on the injustices experienced by women at the hands of patriarchy. Enyonu's pieces cover themes which depart from subtle gestures of reception of the female body, but then spread towards addressing identity and a variety of social practices. While drawing inspiration from her work and life in Kampala, Enyonu's artwork leans on her personal experiences with colorism, especially as a female. Rather ironically, in Uganda, a darker skin shade invites stigma because it's regarded as unattractive. And especially for the case of a woman, sometimes something which has forced many women to opt for bleaching of their own skin. So by painting her sculptures, her subject's body is black, Enyonu seeks to reaffirm that beauty that breathes beneath the darker skin complexion, and to demystify all the existing stigma around blackness, which prevails even in Uganda, where the majority of the people are brown-skinned. The exhibition took its title from one of Enyonu's paintings that you can see on the screen right now. So it was an online exhibition, and I just showing you just a screenshot of how it was hosted by the Art Creator Grid. And I basically had the design of a hand, so raising up our hands and saying we need a space to sit on the table, and you can actually have access to this exhibition right now if you go to Art Creators Grid. And now over to Njabala. So I'll introduce Njabala, which is perceived until now as a long-term project. So Njabala, the title, is inspired by a Ugandan folklore that features Njabala, the lazy girl, who is represented as an obnoxious wife. In the story, Njabala is constantly reprimanded by her mother, who frequented her matrimonial home to teach her the customs and methods of housekeeping, garden cultivation for subsistence, and so on. Njabala's mother sang this song to her as she was teaching her what to do. Njabala, 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 toli nsanza muko Njabala, meaning Njabala, Njabala, don't let your husband find me. Like Njabala's mother, society, through social construction, dictates the identity of a woman. And there are many regressive restrictions for women. Although the conditions are constantly changing, allowing for the woman the space to be emancipated, it should be noted that some aspects of culture have plagued the place of a woman, especially through proverbs and tales such as Njabala. And so, speaking from a personal experience of growing up in rural Uganda and listening to many stories like that of Njabala, which is briefly narrated above, the proposed exhibition, I'm interested in exploring how the stories told mostly to women, to children, influence their lives. I contend that by listening to these stories over and over, young adults conform to their deliberations, hence their associational patterns, identities, decision-making, and value systems are formed wrongly. Note that these stories usually victimized female characters because the warning was meant for the woman. In essence, the stories meant that in life, it was only the woman who had to learn how to serve their male counterparts. And so by suggesting the title Njabala, this is not how. I'm looking at a possibility to retell the story in a more flexible, contemporary, and inclusive perspective, in a way where there is not a singular acceptable way of doing and living for women, but an accepted diversity of choices and decision-making. But the most important objective of this exhibition and campaign is to establish an energetic and productive public forum for exploring new possibilities of social deconditioning, especially by encouraging feminine interactions through verbal and non-verbal dialogue. Each of the featuring artists will be intimately narrating their personal experiences, but all of them will converge to extend the space of femininity in society and assert that women too can be conditions of their own identity. Wishful thinking. So initially I had a long list of proposed artists for the exhibition, namely Lilian Navlime, Sheila Nashtende, Stacey Gillian, Helen Nabukenya, Sandra Suvi, Sarah Ijangolet, Maria Brinch, Krista Uwase, Jess Atieno, Nyakalo Maleke, Kresha Mkwanzi, Nelsa Gwabe, Esther Mbavazi, Imi Mali, Miriam Watsemba, Jessica Bullman, Ruth Ademasu, Sarah Chibombwe, Erin Mark, Gozette Lubondo, Sonia Elizabeth Barrett, Pamela Enyonu, Basheba Okwenje, Charity Natukunda, Guglet Tuduma. These are just some examples of the artists on the list. I just made 3 because I could not put everyone for this 30 minutes. So you can just see. But as the hunt for logistics to have a dream large exhibition for Njawala continues, I have currently settled for the first edition of the female of the Njawala exhibition to be a small one. And so, COVID permitting, the exhibition will take place this year in Makere Art Gallery, featuring Miriam Watsemba, Sandra Suvi, Pamela Enyonu, Immaculate Mali, Basheba Okwanje, and Esther Tebandeke. In this presentation, I'm going to speak about just 3 projects because of time, but I can briefly say that Pamela Enyonu, Sandra Suvi, and Miriam Watsemba will be volunteering to create new works to address the idea of glorification of silence as resilience amongst women. Esther Tebandeke has agreed to show Little Black Dress, a short film implicating men too as carriers of infertility, a burden which has mostly been carried by women. So because of time, I'll expound a bit about the 3 projects that have been confirmed and ready for the exhibition, namely the work of Basheba Okwanje, Miriam Watsemba, and Imi Mali. I hope you can tell the binding threads. So I'll start with, this is the screenshot from Little Black Dress. I'll start with Imi Mali. Imi Mali's Lord seeks to make us imagine or even feel the pain that surrounds sexual abuse, the kind of pain which is more often experienced by one person and in silence, the kind of pain which cannot be talked about in public. Just like that, it is embarrassing to speak about it. How will it be heard? And then I'm going to speak about the work of Miriam Watsemba and the work of Basheba Okwenje, but there's a similarity of sorts of the 2. So you're going to listen to my talk, which kind of groups them together, but they're all connected really. So Miriam Watsemba photography and Basheba Okwenje's photography, oftentimes we hear narrations about occurrences in which people are frozen to numbers. Sentences like 1,000 dead or 2,000 injured is a common occurrence in news. And such sentences could easily pass by if there is not a close relative predicted to be near or around the affected geographic location. And in the fast-moving world, with thousands of occurrences happening, and with the accumulation of screens that share our attention on a daily, it is difficult to follow up on news which might seem to be happening far from us. And the work of Watsemba and Okwenje seeks to demystify these numbers to reach to actual people who suffer such atrocities, especially in war-ridged areas of Uganda, Both artists set out to live and converse with these victims and tell their stories. Both artists' work, especially Watsembas, doesn't go without question about intrusion of space, about ethics in disclosure, and about in what category to place their work. Is it documentary photography? Is it journalism? Is it actually art? And of course, one of the critiques I received from showing Watsemba's images at the entrance in entry gallery in Bergen, in My Mother is Forgetting My Face, was that how come I was showing a failed story? How come I'm sealing a narrative about Africa being torn with war and poverty? And ultimately, the story of the expression, or the expressions per se, by virtue of naming My Mother is Forgetting My Face, was far from a successful story. I know that the truths of the victims are not easy to digest. The work of Watsemba and Okwenje is not at all asking to be accepted for its raw truth. It's a placeholder of the consequences that linger among victims whom we would never have known about, or even their stories, if both artists had not made the encounter to tell their stories. And so in including these stories, I'm keen on acknowledging the practices of young female artists, but also on amplifying not only the stories they tell, but also the stories of their subjects, in telling them to wider audiences and in exposing the trauma that follows these victims decades after a single offense. And this photograph that you see, the story is a lady named Alice Otua, with 31 years old, who Watsemba says she is a former IDP, so internally displaced person in Gulu district, whose womb was blemished as a result of gang rape. The artist sees the story of Alice Otua as another encounter in regard to women being silenced and by stigmatization, society expectations, and lack of justice for crimes inflicted on them. Justice for crimes of rape and molestation for Otua that occurred when she was 16 may never come. Of course, Otua is now barren because of the gang rape, and because she got pregnant from that rape and she did not know that she was pregnant and that she had a miscarriage, and she kept the baby for several months. And that, of course, destroyed her womb. And now she's incapable of giving birth and made fun of by her society and by the other wives of her husband because she cannot give birth. Then I'll speak about the work of Basheba Okwenje, Kanyo Love. It's independent but connected. So you can look at, I'll just read. The title takes inspiration from Acholi word Kanyo, which means endure, to be resilient. And Kanyo Love is an intimate body of work about post-conflict reintegration in northern Uganda. The theme is explored through an investigation of ways in which 36 former forced wives, mark the word, forced wives of Lord's Resistance Army combatants find love and experience courtship after the war. The project consists of a series of works that function separately or together as a more comprehensive body of work. This presentation includes individual portraits of former forced wives of Lord Resistance Army combatants, a photographic archive of courtship gifts that they received after the war, and testimonies of the post-war romantic love relationships. This is just an excerpt from one of the interviews that Basheba Okwenje held with Awan Beatrice. And she was asking, is this love different from your husband in the bush? And she said, it's very, very true that the love from the bush is not love because you're given to someone forcefully. It is just by force. But at home, you can make your own decision. So you can make love with a boy if you want. The first edition of the Njawala exhibition is expected to take place this year at Makerere Art Gallery with support from AHRC, Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK. A philanthropist has expressed to help in allowing Njawala's projects come to pass. Currently, a software developer from Kenya is designing the website, and Sarah Jangolet, one of Uganda's female artists invested in the theme of folklore, is designing our logo. Conclusion. My sincere thanks goes to everyone who has supported this journey. When I first wrote the Njawala concept in 2019, I was looking to have an ambitious exhibition with several artists from different parts of Africa and abroad. This is still the dream, to organize groundbreaking exhibitions and events which can facilitate this fair and respectable consumption of art by female artists. But just like Njawala's mother, many people in society have been conditioned to take on patriarchy without questioning resisting it. And by extension, our work at Njawala might not be received with both hands. Nonetheless, inspirations, as you've noticed, is that until we achieve a fair representation, until female artists get to be collected as their male counterparts, until female artists get to flourish at their careers, the team at Njawala will still have work to do, of course, in close collaborations with the main stakeholders and partners. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup Martha, merci pour ce travail remarquable, merci de nous faire découvrir tant d'artistes extrêmement intéressantes. C'est vrai qu'on se rend compte que beaucoup d'histoires de femmes, de récits de femmes qui ne sont pas dévoilés sont cependant riches de faits, et on voit bien l'importance de refaire revivre ces récits par le biais de différentes pratiques. Mais par rapport au concept de Njawala, ce qui est aussi remarquable, c'est qu'on voit comment un folklore, une histoire locale, lorsqu'elle est révélée et partagée aux plus nombreux, peut finalement représenter une forme d'inspiration pour l'élite féministe de tous bords. Mais je pense qu'on va y revenir un petit peu plus tard, et notamment sur cette notion de lieu sûr. L'importance de créer des espèces de lieux alternatifs où ces récits pourraient se déployer.